So we're going to be discussing the academic essay. Just for maximum confusion, I use the terms essay and paper interchangeably. Uh, I've started to use the term paper more and more because it's actually the college term for a piece of expository prose or literary analysis. You'll hear professors say you can expect to take a midterm, a final, and write 3 short papers. But again, essay and paper, the terms are the same. And in this presentation, I use the term essay. So the term essay for a piece of prose expository writing comes from the French Renaissance writer and thinker Michel de Montaigne, whose picture you see here. He was a winemaker and a public figure, a politician in his region of France, in Bordeaux. And he underwent a spiritual crisis midway through his life. And so, in order to sort of work through this crisis, he sequestered himself in his chateau, and he started writing these prose pieces in which he would sort of tackle problems both in his own life and then sort of in his sort of culture at large. And these prose pieces he would call essays. And the term essay comes from the French verb essayer, which means to attempt or to try. And in these essays, he attempted to work out problems. He would bring up a problem, he would sort of propose a solution, he would use classical text as the backup for his solution, and then he would draw conclusions. And so it's sort of the same model we use today. Now, to be fair, Montaigne did not write academic essays in the sense that we think of them today. He actually wrote more personal essays, and his essays were grounded in personal experience. But we sort of follow his model ever since. So we will sort of keep Montaigne in mind as we write. So let's begin by first defining what an essay is. And Professor Vincent Rocchio of Northeastern University in Boston, I think, has come up with a really nice definition of what an essay is and the purpose of it. So he says, the purpose of the academic essay is to persuade by reasoned discourse. Scholars use the essay amongst themselves to advance ideas. And this is the perfect summation to me of what an essay is. It's meant to persuade, so it has to be arguable, right? An essay has to argue something. Because if it's not arguable, you can't persuade anyone because there's nothing to persuade. But the most important part for me is that an essay advances ideas. So you're not writing a book report, right? You're not writing a paper in which you tell me that Dostoevsky was Russian, that he wrote prose fiction. I mean, we know all that already. The purpose of your essay is to advance the discourse on a topic. And I love getting essays back from students because oftentimes they will make me think of literature in ways I'd never thought. So they are advancing the discourse on a particular topic. They're adding to the received sort of knowledge of a particular work of literature. So again, I think Professor Rocchio's definition of an essay is particularly apt and helpful. So the academic essay is persuasive by nature, and these are some of the conventions of the academic essay. An academic essay makes a controversial claim that can be defended, and by controversial, we don't mean, for example, you claiming that Dostoevsky was a French spy who tried to overthrow Queen Victoria. That's just silliness, right? Controversial in this case meaning something that can be argued, and you're arguing something about literature and literary theory. An academic essay offers reasons in support of the claim. It doesn't just claim something, it offers backup for it. And again, following Michel de Montaigne's habit, as it were, of using classical texts to back up his observations and ideas. An academic essay acknowledges reasons against the claim. So, for example, you'll learn when you learn how to write conclusions that actually you end up arguing against yourself, but for the sheer purpose of then showing how you're right. But we'll come to that later. An academic essay is highly constructed and organized. It is not extemporaneous or off the cuff. It is very well thought out and planned out. However you like to plan, there are different ways of doing it. An academic essay, in an academic essay, the writer's voice is professional and comparatively detached. So it's not a sort of personal discourse, right? It's professional. It's sort of how you would speak at a job interview or at a conference, an academic conference. And lastly, in persuasive academic writing, the diction is elevated and academic, but it's not pretentious, right? You don't have to use $24,000 words. In fact, most of the time you don't want to do that. So you should still be you, but it's your professional you. But don't pretend to be somebody else, all right? Let's not be pretentious. That's just silly. All right? So these are sort of the basic conventions of the academic essay. And for our purposes, the academic essay is inherently persuasive. So here's your basic essay. Introduction and argument, then some body paragraphs, and then a conclusion. Right? And you've had this drilled into you from an early age, so nothing new and surprising here. So let's actually start with the introduction. So we're going to break out the essay into its constituent parts, and let's begin with the introduction. Or, as I will also call it in this presentation, introductory paragraph. Same thing. So what is the purpose of the introduction? Well, firstly, it's to hook the reader's interest. Right? You want the reader to actually read your essay. The next purpose is to compel your reader to agree with your point of view via an argument or a thesis statement. So in your introductory paragraph or your introduction, you need to get your reader, compel them to agree with you, right? And you do that through a thesis or an argument. And I use the terms thesis and argument interchangeably here. Lastly, you want to alert the reader to what they're going to read in a very systematic and coherent manner, right? You need to give them a roadmap. Readers don't like to be surprised or led off the path, right? Give them a coherent roadmap to what they're going to read, all right? So the purposes of the introduction are to hook, to compel, and then finally to alert the reader, right? And for the purposes of this discussion, assume the reader is sort of educated in literary theory and literature, but may not necessarily have read the book you're going to be talking about. So, in this presentation, I use sort of the rule of 4. Every constituent part of the essay can be broken down into 4 different elements. So, your introductory paragraph can be broken down into a hook, a pre-argument or pre-thesis, an argument or thesis, and a clever wrap-up. Now, I'll spend most of the time talking about the different types of hooks and the different sort of ways to argue. I don't spend very much time on the pre-argument and the clever wrap-up. The pre-argument or pre-thesis is simply a way to get from the hook to the argument. It's often a chance for you to add context and some facts that a reader needs to know before they can truly appreciate what you're arguing. Again, you can't assume that the reader knows everything about your book or anything at all. So again, that pre-argument or sort of a pre-thesis gets you from the hook, the attention grabbing, to the argument, the meat of your essay. And the clever wrap-up is one sentence that links your introductory paragraph to your first body paragraph. So here's the same thing, just in a different form. So the hook, the pre-argument or pre-thesis, the argument or thesis, and then your clever wrap-up. Here are the parts of the introduction or introductory paragraph. So let's talk about hooks. And of course, here's the most famous hook, possibly of all time, is our Captain Hook. So he'll sort of be our guide through this part of the presentation. So the hook is everything in a way, because if you haven't hooked your reader, you can't argue anything because they're not going to be paying attention anyway, right? So you may have come up with the most amazing academic insight since we emerged from the primordial ooze. It may your academic insight may obliterate the mind conception of zero, Newton's theories of gravity, or Justin Bieber's discovery of the tattoo. All very amazing additions to sort of human endeavor. But if you don't grab your reader's attention, your insight will go the way of In Search of Lost Time, or Moby Dick, or War and Peace. No one will actually read it. So your hook has got to get the attention that your paper needs and deserves. So here's what a hook is and isn't. The white text is what a hook should be, and the green text is what a hook should not be. Okay, so a hook is an efficient tool for gaining your reader's attention and interest, right? A hook is not a cheap attempt at shock or awe or fake controversy, right? Don't be silly, essentially. A hook is a concise overture to your academic essay, hinting intelligently at what is to come. Concise meaning it's short. The hook should not be longer than the thesis. A hook is not a chance to comment on the human condition or in any way mention the human condition. Do not ever mention anything about humanity, its condition, its state, its issues, its fears, its triumphs, its ups, its downs. Nobody wants to read an academic essay that deals with the human condition. Even if you write that paper, no one wants to read it. They may even want to burn it or you. And I say this because students always want to talk about humanity in their essays on literary form. And it's just, you can't do it. And those essays are incredibly boring anyway. All right, let's talk about the different types of hooks you can use in your academic essay. And there are five. All right. The first type of hook that you can use is what I call synecdoche. And synecdoche is a literary term. And it's a term we use for when we use part of something to represent the whole that it comes from. So, for example, when you say to someone, I would like your hand in marriage, right? You want the rest of the person to come along, right, into that marriage. But you say, I want your hand. That's an example of synecdoche. The part, the hand, stands in for the whole person, right? Or if we say about royalty, the crown would be very pleased if you would remove your armies from our nation, right? Well, the crown is part of the queen, right? But that crown is meant to stand in for the queen. So the first type of hook is when you use a very specific element of a text that you think is very illustrative of the point you're talking about, and you let that very minute section stand in for the whole. All right. So I'm going to use as an example for the different types of hooks. Eugene Onegin is going to be our text that I'm going to use, and we're sort of like creating a mock paper about Onegin. All right. So in these slides about the different hook types, what's in blue is our kind of mock paper. All right. And by the way, in these blue sort of mock paper, sort of verbiage, I'm showing you how to properly cite titles and page numbers as necessary. All right. So in every introductory paragraph, the first time you mention a work of literature, you must also include its year, the year in which it was published. All right. You should also mention the author as well. In this case, I haven't mentioned Pushkin's name in this. I probably should have, but you'll see other examples in which I do. The first time you mention an author's name, you must use the first and last name. Every time thereafter, you can just use the last name. All right, so here's an example of a hook that uses synecdoche, the part standing in for the whole. Okay. Early in Book 6 of Eugene Onegin, the narrator reminds us who the novel is really about. Quote, but onward, onward, my history, unquote. It is in fact the narrator's story, with the title character playing a secondary role. So, for example, I've decided that this part of Onegin, this one line, really stands in for the whole concept of this intrusive narrator, right? That's synecdoche. So my hook is that I point out one specific textual element, this line about, but onward, onward, my history. Because I think it stands in for the whole point that I'm making, right? So it kind of primes the reader. It gets them ready for what I'm going to talk about. That's the first type of hook. The second type is what I call the gotcha sentence. And this is a short declarative sentence with some controversy behind it, right? And I hate to use sort of a militaristic image, but it's sort of like a bomb, as it were. You drop it, it does its thing, and it's done. But it's very impactful. You have to be careful, though. If it's not done right, I mean, think about it. You can't unbomb something, right? If your gotcha sentence is irrelevant, inaccurate, it can really ruin the rest of the paper because I'm not going to want to go on and read it, right? So you have to be careful, but it can be very effective. And actually, I recommend this, especially for students who tend to be long-winded, right? So here's an example of a gotcha sentence. Eugene Onegin is not at all about a man named Eugene Onegin. It is a story about a narrator. So there's your gotcha. It makes a very distinct, quick point, and it could be, controversial. It could be argued very easily. All right. So there's your gotcha sentence. And again, the gotcha sentence has to be short, or else it's not a gotcha sentence. It's just a long-winded observation. The third type of hook is what I call let the writer work for you. And that's when you use a quote from the book that you're writing about that you think, again, is illustrative of what you're going to talk about. Unlike synecdoche, though, usually the quote is longer, right? It's not quite one little bit stands in for everything, but it's not dissimilar. So let the writer work for you. This often is the one I recommend for students if they're really stuck, right? Just find a quote that you think matches and then use that to get the reader going. So here's an example. So I quote this piece of text and then I say, so begins Alexander Pushkin's novel Eugene Onegin, a novel about an intrusive narrator, not about the title character. So again, my quote is an example of narratorial intrusiveness, and then I go on. So if you're 2 o'clock in the morning, you're stuck for a hook, The quote is always a good thing. However, make sure the quote's from the book you're reading, right? Some people like to find quotes by Gandhi or by Frederick Douglass. It's really not a good idea, right? Because then your paper takes on a whole different element than you wanted it to. If you're using if you're writing about a book, use the book. So this hook I call the history lesson, and it's dangerous because it's easy to ramble here. But if you know something about the history of the culture that produced the book, or even how the book itself came to be written, it can be a very effective hook uh, for a reader because it gives the reader instant context. Just got to be careful though that the history you're talking about is relevant to the literary point you'll be making later. So here's an example. In 1825, Russia was modernizing and urbanizing. Cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg were the artistic and intellectual capitals of a country struggling with its identity. Join Europe and its enlightenment, or remain aloof. That struggle was played out in Alexander Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, between the urban dandy Onegin and the rural innocent Tatiana. So the sort of historical context that I'm giving here is that when Pushkin wrote his novel, Russia was in fact struggling with itself, right? It was sort of a sort of engaging in a kind of duality. Do they go toward Europe and modernization, or do they stay more really in Asia? And do they sort of become more insular? Not to imply that Asia was any more insular, but Russian sort of intellectuals at that time were really split between becoming European and staying Asian, right? And you can argue that split is played out in Onegin, because you've got Tatiana on the one end who represents certain virtues, and Onegin on the other end who also represents certain virtues. So again, make sure the history aspect, the context that you're giving for the hook, makes sense and matches with what you want to talk about literarily. And last is what I call the big picture. And this again can be dangerous because it's easy to get off the track and get a bit sort of tangent oriented. But sometimes a universal truth is convenient as a hook. So here's an example. It is in our natures to tell a story self-reflexively, even if the story is not about us. The narrator of Alexander Pushkin's Eugene Onegin is the case in point. So here's a universal truth or a big picture. We tend to tell stories in which we end up being a character, right? Because that's exactly what happened in Eugene Onegin. So this can be a very effective hook. The problem again is that this is the hook that tends to go off into the human condition and all that nonsense. So just be again short declarative sentence. But this can be a very good hook because readers can relate, right? So it's a very smart, savvy way of getting the reader's attention. So there are your 5 hook types, and of course you want to pick the one that you think makes the most sense with the argument you're going to end up making. All right. So here's again our paradigm. So we've just talked about the hook, right? Again, after the hook comes the pre-argument. All that is that you just give a little bit of context. So, for example, if this is my hook, it is in our natures to tell a story self-reflexively, even if the story is not about us. The narrator of Alexander Pushkin's Eugene Onegin is a case in point. That's my hook. My pre-argument, my pre-thesis, or my bridge, as some people call it, may simply be to explain to the reader that Eugene Onegin features an autodiegetic or homodiegetic narrator, depending what you think, right? And I may explain briefly what that is. So I just I give some information that will help the reader understand my thesis, right? So here's my hook. You see it in front of you in blue. My pre-argument might be something to the effect of, this narrator that Pushkin creates is a homodiegetic narrator that also happens to be very involved in the story, right? Just some context, a quick information. And then I move on to my thesis, or my argument, depending what I want to call it. Now, before we actually get into thesis writing and sort of specific argument writing, we're going to take a bit of a detour here. All the slides in this section that are headed in green relate to argumentation and rhetoric more generally. So Mr. Rosenberg, who teaches AP Language and Composition, has asked me to sort of give you some basic introductions to some basic rhetorical argumentative sort of concepts. So I'm going to take a bit of a pause in this presentation to do that, and then we're going to find our way back to our sort of practical guide to writing essays. All right. Um, Now, if you want to skip this section, and you can skip the slides that are headed in green, if you either for time or if it's if you want to get a more streamlined experience. But eventually, this section in sort of in the green headings does wend its way back to what we're going to be talking about. So here is you in your sort of ship, rocking to the side, about to be overwhelmed by this wave. And here is the rocket-bed arguments in which so many students are dashed against it because they get scared of writing thesis statements and arguments. You really don't have to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you exactly what type of argument you're going to be writing in a literary analysis paper. So let's talk about argumentation here a little bit more generally. So there are three types of arguments that you can write in a paper. And of course, to be confusing, they're called statements. They are the statement of fact, the statement of value, and the statement of policy. So in any argumentative or academic essay, you will use one of these types of arguments called statements. We're going to focus on the statement of fact, but I'll show you the other ones as well. So, a statement of fact, an argument that proposes something you believe to be a fact, right? So, for example, and by the way, these texts that I use in this section, you probably have not read, but it won't hinder your understanding. So here's a statement of fact. Okay, Voltaire's Candide is the earliest example of metafiction in Western literature. I am presenting this as a fact. It's arguable. It needs to be, right? It's an argument. But I'm presenting it as if it were true. All right? It's a statement of fact. I'm telling you it's a fact. Whether you agree with me or not is up to you. But I'm presenting it as if it were fact. Another example. Harriet Jacobs' memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is actually a novel since it follows all of the novel's main tropes. So I'm presenting this as a fact, right? It's a statement of fact. It is an argument because I can be disagreed with here, right? But I'm presenting it as if it were a fact. So that's called a statement of fact. And that's the kind you're going to be writing in this class. But just for your information, I'll show you the other two. A statement of value is an argument that offers an evaluation or a judgment. So, for example, Voltaire's Candide is the best novel ever written. Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is a terrible memoir, but a brilliant novel. You would never write these in an academic paper, at least most of the academic papers you'll write in college and high school, because most don't really care about what you feel or think, in the sense that they don't care whether you think something's the best or the worst. They want to know what you think on a more sort of on a deeper level, on a more structural level. But now statements of value are often used in commercials or advertising, or they're used in criticism, like arts critics, music critics, that sort of thing. The statement of policy is an argument that proposes a way of behaving, right? Or argues for a particular policy. So, if you want to read the first example of metafiction in Western literature, read Voltaire's Candide, right? This person is suggesting you behave in a certain way. Okay, that's a statement of policy, right? It should be your personal policy to read Candide if you want a good example of metafiction. Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl should be taught in every classroom in America. Again, statement of policy. It's suggesting you behave in a certain way. Again, you would never write this in a literary analysis paper, right? Just like you would never write the statement of value in a literary analysis paper, right? So we're going with statement of fact. So again, the types of arguments out there in the world: statement of fact, which we're going to focus on, statement of value, and statement of policy. And again, this is what we're going to work with, the statement of fact. Now, for sheer confusion, there is a particular type of statement of fact that you're going to be writing. It's called the argument of function, right? And I know whoever devised this flip-flopping back and forth between argument and statement, I apologize on their behalf. So, you write your statement of fact. You're presenting a fact to your reader about your work of literature, right? You're going to be engaging in what's called an argument of function. So again, a particular type of statement of fact is called an argument of function. And that's what you're going to focus on as a writer of literary analysis. So, what is it? When you make an argument of function, you are claiming that a writer is doing something for a particular reason. Function, doing, right? You are claiming that a writer's work serves some kind of function. Here's an example. By creating a series of characters with whom we can empathize, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin does not rely on the moral arguments against slavery, it relies on emotional ones. So this is an argument of function. We're arguing that Stowe does something. She creates a series of characters, right? She has a function, right? She's doing something, right? And by creating characters, right, she's doing something else. So think about doing. Think about authors doing things on purpose. That's an argument of function. Here's an example from the opera world. We're going to talk about Onegin here in Tchaikovsky's opera version. So, in Eugene Onegin, Tchaikovsky creates a story about a young woman named Tatiana, in keeping with the convention of opera as a gynocentric genre. So, here we're arguing that Tchaikovsky does something. He creates a story, right? He's doing something. He's serving a function. He creates a story for the express purpose of keeping with the conventions of a genre, right? So an argument of function is one in which we say that the author is doing something for a particular reason. That is literary analysis right there. Every literary analysis paper you will write is one in which you're arguing that an author is doing something for a specific reason. That's the argument of function, right? So again, for example, by using an A-B rhyme scheme, Samuel Taylor Coleridge in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is alluding to the medieval ballad for the purposes of tapping in to England's cultural heritage, right? He's doing something. He's using a rhyme scheme to tap into a cultural heritage. That's an argument of function. All right. So now you've learned the type of argument you're going to write. Now let's actually do it, right? And again, thesis, argument, same thing. I use them interchangeably just for maximum confusion. I've included this picture. This is a very famous self-portrait by the 19th century French realist painter Gustave Courbet. And he was, like you can tell, very flamboyant and sort of loved sort of self promotion, that kind of thing. And this is the face I get often when I mention the term thesis to students. The sort of hair rending and sort of fear in the eye sort of thing. And it's actually not that hard. The only thing about a thesis that most students have trouble with is making it actually arguable, right? And unfortunately, thesis statements have been taught, retaught, mistaught, undertaught, overtaught. So let's see if we can sort of just wrap our brains around this. So, this slide just basically tells you I use argument and thesis interchangeably. There are two types of thesis statements, simple and complex. You're going to start with simple in your first paper, and then you'll go to complex for your second paper. All right? So, for example, if you're in my third period, you'll start with simple when you write about either Pushkin or Dostoevsky or Proust or Chopin. Right? Your complex thesis will be about War and Peace. If you're in my fifth period, you'll write your simple thesis about Dostoevsky or Pushkin or Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Your complex thesis will be about Richard Wright's, Richard Wright's Native Son. All right? So let's talk about the different types of thesis statements. Now we're going to be using a piece of music as our kind of case study. And it's the French composer Francis Poulenc's choral work Gloria. Which is a religious work, based on Catholic liturgy. So at this point, you're going to want to click over to my blog and find the link to the YouTube clip of Gloria and listen to about the first 2-3 minutes. That's all you should be listening to. You should not be listening to more than that. I've either included a clip of just a part or I've included the whole thing, depending on what clip I could actually find. If you find the whole thing, just watch the first 2-3 minutes of it. All right. So pause this presentation, click over there, find that, watch that, listen to it, and then come back here. So here's an example of a simple thesis using Francis Poulenc's choral work. Francis Poulenc's use of bounty staccato rhythms in the first movement of his Gloria implies the celebratory nature of the lyrics, which proclaim the birth of Christ. So you're arguing one thing, right? And the one sort of point you're going to make is this idea of bouncy staccato rhythm that implies something. right? And there's your argument of function. We're arguing that Francis Poulenc does something, right? He uses staccato rhythms in order to imply, right? That's a simple thesis statement or argument. Now, a complex thesis, as you can imagine, argues multiple points. But all those points, they're still relating to one unifying argument. In Gloria, Francis Poulenc presents a Christianity that is simultaneously joyous and pensive. Through his use of bouncy staccato rhythms, heavily accented notes, and forceful tempos, he hints at the very function of the Catholic Mass itself, to both celebrate and reflect. All right. So, and this is the same thesis. So we have 3 points. This paper would technically be the sort of classical 5-paragraph essay. Intro, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. All right. Now, the main argument is that I'm saying that his choral work hints at the very function of the Catholic Mass itself. All right. And each one of these elements is going to back that up. It just so happens I'm making more points. So if I go back, my simple thesis only argues one thing, right? I'm only going to have one piece, sort of one point to make in order to prove that the rhythm implies celebration, right? Whereas in my complex thesis, I just happen to I just happen to be more specific. I'm going into more detail. I'm going to make 3 points, okay? Every point you make in a thesis gets its own paragraph, its own body paragraph. All right? Now, there are bad thesis statements in the world. And I'm going to show you a couple of common mistakes students make. You can click through this if you want, right? And just move on from here. But for some of you, this might help you avoid some of the pitfalls that students often fall into with regard to thesis statements. The first kind of thesis statement that I get, that I see in papers that's troublesome, is what I call the why bother, right? And it's the one which makes us nod our heads and politely sort of say, okay, and so, right? Or sort of what I call the sky is blue, right? Well, thank you, but that doesn't help me, right? I can't argue that. What am I going to argue, right? So a why bother thesis is the one that doesn't need proving. It is. So for example, Francis Poulenc in his Gloria uses staccato rhythms to make his point. Okay, and I mean, you might as well have written Francis Poulenc was wearing underwear when he wrote his Gloria. I mean, I suppose he could have gone commando, but I assume that he was doing that. Just like I assume that a composer uses rhythm, right? This thesis will go nowhere, right? There's nothing to argue. Another example of one is what I call the "Do you have 100 years?", which is a thesis that is so broad that it would take 100 years to write it, to write the paper that would back it up, and 100 years for me to read it. And here's an example. Francis Poulenc uses his Gloria to reflect on the very foundations of Western music and its general adherence to the principles of tonality. There's no way you can prove this in a short paper. And I've used myself here as an example. My undergraduate thesis at Cal was 17 pages long, right? And I had a very specific thesis. This is way too broad, right? It would take you an entire book to address this issue. And students have a knack for writing these massive thesis statements that it would take a whole book to prove. You need to be specific. Now, the other problem is that sometimes you get too specific, and I call this the gnat's ass. And this is apparently something that a witticism that I've used that not many people do, but there's a term called the gnat's ass, and that's when, for example, when you do something so specifically and in such a fussy way that it's said that you do it down to a gnat's ass. So, for example, if I grade a paper of yours and just note every single little thing you do, right? Every I you didn't dot, every T you didn't cross, right? You could say that I was grading it down to a gnat's ass. And this is an example, like a thesis, in which it is so specific that there's nowhere to go with it. It's the exact opposite of the previous one, right? So it'd make for a very short paper. So for example, Francis Poulenc uses a dotted half note in measure 15 of his Gloria to signify that Christ will rise again by the end of the work. This is too specific for a thesis statement, right? You're not going to write a whole paper on this one observation. It's too specific. This would be an interesting body paragraph, possibly, but it's not broad enough. You need a little bit of wiggle room right here. This is, again, too narrow. All right, so let's kind of put it together, this sort of introductory paragraph. We've talked about the hook. I mentioned that the pre-thesis or pre-argument just gets you from your hook to your argument, or thesis, pardon me. And the thesis and argument is what is the point you're making, right? And we will get to the clever wrap-up in a moment. So this is an example of a mock paper that I've written based on Jane Austen's book Persuasion, which we haven't read in this class, but it won't hinder you from understanding it. All right, so I've broken out the 4 different elements. In green is your hook, in yellow is your pre-thesis or pre-argument, in pink is your thesis or argument, and then your orange is the clever wrap-up, and we'll get there in a moment. So go ahead and read this, pause, and then when you're ready, unpause it and move on and to the explanation. So here's the hook. Right? And I've used hook number 3. Let the author work for you. Now, in this case, instead of using Jane Austen, I've used a Jane Austen scholar, but I've quoted him, right? Because he makes a very good point that does a lot of the work for me. And in this section of the presentation, by the way, I'm not going to read off everything. So go ahead and pause and read, and then you can move on when you're ready. And here's our pre-thesis. Again, it gives context. It gives background, right? It sort of helps guide the reader to where I'm going to go with the thesis or the argument. All right, and it may be a little bit overwritten, but you'll get the idea. Depending on what you want to argue, you may have to give the reader more context or less, depending. And I kind of like to say that this sets the pace. This sort of paves the way for the blam moment, what I call it, the blam. The thesis comes in, right? You're getting the audience ready for that thesis to come in. And here's that thesis. In this case, it happens to be 2 sentences. Most of the time, you only want it to be 1. And the clever wrap-up is just a short, and I mean short, pithy, maybe even vaguely clever sentence that connects the introductory paragraph to the first body paragraph. It's just sort of a nice little summation, little wrap-up. You can be a little bit clever. You can kind of show your skills as an orator, not even an orator, as a writer, as a prose stylist. All right, just don't get too clever with the clever wrap up. All right, just a way to summarize, kind of in 1 sentence, what you're going to be talking about, and to move on to the next paragraph. And once again, here is our introductory paragraph, and again, I've sort of cited specifically our sort of mock Jane Austen paper here. At this point, you can pause, and when you're ready to move on to the body paragraph, you can do so.